No worries.
And make sure you can hear me. Is that
Yeah,
good?
because I think with the amplification too, that might be helpful as well.
Okay.
Yeah?
Okay. Yeah, don't worry about me.
Okay, well, I worry about all of us being able to be included and heard. So, okay. Thank you so much for everybody getting together. Carly, take it away.
Thank you so much. Good evening. So the purpose of this workshop is to discuss some of the big water issues that I know so many people in the community have had questions about, as well as this council. It's a main priority of this council to address our constrained water future. It's looking like it's going to be a more serious situation in the future. So what we had in mind is to discuss a new approach to the city's water resource management planning that Chuck and I have developed over the past few months as we've been identifying emergent threats and issues. As just a brief overview, this new approach will be guided by a water resource management work plan, which will be basically a staff work plan that will be changed over time. It's certainly adaptable. To give guidance to staff like me and the administration to understand what our priorities are and what work we have to do. A critical component of this plan are new city ordinances and regulations that are necessary to secure and preserve our water supply. And among these ordinances, just as a brief kind of teaser, is a water dedication regime that we think should be explored. This would require certain developers or certain types of development to dedicate water or bring water in order to be permitted to develop. I highlight this because I know the community is concerned about the role that new development is playing in this constrained water future, and there's a need to protect our groundwater supply. So I'll talk about it more, but we anticipate embarking on that kind of effort. It also involves intensive coordination with the other Moab Valley water providers, not the ordinance, but the work ahead, because we realize what we do impacts them and what they do impacts us as well. It also would help us optimize the water system more than what it is experiencing now. So just a brief introduction to about why we need sort of a radical new approach to water management. First, I think what teed it off for the community was the better information we have about the aquifer and the amount of water down there, or we don't have as much water as previously thought. So I think that has set off a lot of consideration for many in the community and the water providers because they were planning with one amount in mind, and that just is turning out not to be the case. We're also experiencing explosive growth. We have many issues and threats facing us because of climate change. We're facing ongoing drought. We have new and emerging threats to the watershed. I think the Pack Creek fire is a good example of that. We might be experiencing more and more of those in the future, and it's unclear what kind of impact they will have on our water supply. As well as development pressures. We have just sat in a protest hearing with the state engineer because we have new developers wanting to dwell in our surface water field. So we're battling those more and more too. We also have the threat of aging infrastructure. So we might have this remarkable supply that we're able to secure, but our distribution system, which is probably one of our weakest links, is also a problem. So all of these problems need to be addressed in order to secure a resilient water supply. And the only way to address them adequately is with a more integrated, comprehensive approach to managing the valley's precious water resources. And the work plan that I will be presenting today will lay out that comprehensive approach. Before I dive into the work plan, I know this isn't the exciting stuff, but I think it might be useful to take some time to review the regulatory and legal framework that the city must operate within. This is important information because it lets the community know what kind of tools are available to us. And I also wanted to give a brief overview of the kind of water situation, because there are a lot of numbers flying around out there, and this is certainly not all the information available. There are many more quantifications that people are curious about, but some of the ones that I'm hearing about more and more, let's just give a rough overview. So according to the state engineer's office, there are approximately 30,000 acre-feet of wet approved water available to the valley. So not simply water rights, but wet approved water. This includes surface water like Mill Creek and Pack Creek. This includes the Aquifer, which has the least amount, and then approved water rights on the Colorado River. The city does not have those, but they're available to other agencies. We use approximately, there are a lot of ways to calculate our current use. Our culinary use alone is about 1,600 acre-feet, is that right, Chuck?
Yes.
But our total delivery last year was 3,300 acre-feet. So of the 30,000, the city is using about 3,300. We have a production capacity that's larger than our delivery, which is about 53 to 5,400 acre-feet of water. So we still aren't up against our production capacity. We have some wiggle room there, but it's also important that we need like a production capacity that's greater than our total delivery to deal with peak demand. So that's why it's a little bigger.
And that capacity is like wells and
Yeah, right, exactly.
pipes and stuff.
Pipes and stuff like that. Fire flow, you know, those kinds of things that you don't necessarily see, but that we have to account for in our system. The estimated aquifer capacity, there is a lot of discussion about what this is. It's a lot less than we thought, which is why it's very concerning. But it's approximately 10,000 acre-feet. And we have not yet approached safe yield with that amount. There's more, of course, but we can't draw much more because of safe yield considerations. And the state engineer estimates that there is approximately 1,300 to 3,500 acre-feet of additional groundwater that can be developed before reaching safe yield. These are important numbers because what the state engineer says matters very much when it comes to what kind of action we're allowed to take and how we justify our action. So I know a lot of people disagree with the state engineer's numbers, but it's not totally relevant to some like legal and defensible, whether you agree or not, it is the number that matters in a lot of ways. It doesn't really matter to how we manage our own system, so we can be much more conservative than the state engineer, certainly. But whenever we're talking about justifying something because of safe yield, as long as the state engineer says there's up to 3,500 acre-feet, we're going to have a problem. But for a larger discussion later on. We also have like some legal and regulatory considerations for when we're developing water policies and ordinances. And I will talk about a couple of them. The first one is the one we just talked about, the tricky issue of safe yield. Safe yield's a really controversial idea. It's not totally, you know, Mila just sent out a really good article about maybe it's not the most environmentally or like prudent way to think about the water, about groundwater supply. And I tend to agree with it, but because safe yield is in statute, we have to care about it. We can't determine what safe yield is, only the state engineer can. And yeah, I think I've sort of explained that kind of constraint. We have other supply options, and this is a problem because, well, not a problem. It's a consideration because the groundwater is just 1/3 of the pie of water that's out there. And so any sort of regulations need to consider the other sources of supply and what our duty is to develop those, to make those available to our inhabitants. And we need to make sure that any policies or regulations we develop don't harm those as well or have unintended consequences with them. Then this yellow box talks about our water supplier obligations required by the Utah State Constitution, and this is also by Utah State statute. So really quickly, let me just explain. Sorry, I'm grabbing my notes for this. So Article 11, Section 6 of the Utah Constitution addresses municipal water rights and our water sources specifically. It provides that a municipality, quote, may not directly or indirectly lease, sell, alienate, or dispose of any of its water rights or sources of water supply. And we shall preserve and maintain those water rights and sources of water to supply water to the municipality's inhabitants and others within the municipality's designated water service area. In other words, the city may be constitutionally required to preserve and maintain its water rights and water sources to supply water to its inhabitants, and we need to avoid disposing of the water rights indirectly by determining not to use and develop our water sources. It's an interesting constitutional provision. I don't know if it exists in other state constitutions, but and it hasn't really been litigated. It's been raised before, but the Supreme Court decided a case on different grounds and didn't ask the specific question. But it's an emerging thread of litigation, arguing that cities have a proactive duty to develop its water resources for its inhabitants. And additionally, there is a Utah state statute that talks about what we, we'll go to equal protection issues, sorry. So this blue box, talking about equal protection issues. So the US Constitution and the Utah State Constitution contain provisions safeguarding individuals' right to equal protection under the law. And additionally, Utah statutory code provides that anytime we apply a restriction on water use to retail customers, we have to do it with the provisions of equal protection in mind. In other words, we have to have a rational basis for everything that we do when it comes to water restrictions. Otherwise, we might face a discrimination claim. Another thing that we have to consider are regulatory takings issues. I don't know of any case or ordinance or regulation that has taken water from an already wet lot. Another way to explain it is if someone already has water service that's provided by the city, that's arguably in their bundle of sticks that they acquire when they buy that property. And so if we impose a regulation that takes it away, they may have a regulatory takings case. So wet lots, already developed lots, are arguably wet unless we can compensate those people for the taking. Again, it's hard to say how these play out because they're really fact specific. It would be a little unprecedented if we were to go down any sort of avenue that removes water service from developed wet property.
So that means future permits that we provide, we have to be able to ensure that we can provide water to any future permits we
Yes.
grant.
Well, it would mean that, it in
Otherwise
this
we
case,
get
so
caught.
like, say I tear down my house and then I go and get a building permit and the city says, you need to demonstrate water because we aren't giving you a building permit unless you bring water to the table. The argument would be, I bought water already. That was part of the bundle of sticks on my property. So it's true, thinking forward, being very careful about what kind of water guarantees we're making, one, and realizing that probably like the amount of water that we have now is probably kind of set, like the development footprint when it comes to water, if that makes sense. Unless we compensate them for the taking. That's another option. So these takings issues, wouldn't apply to annexations because they have no such promise right now. That doesn't exist in the bundle of sticks. And it's unclear if it would apply to properties that are totally undeveloped with no water connection because they don't have it right now. But those would need to be teased out in an ordinance, any sort of restriction ordinance. And then the sixth consideration is that any alternative or any ordinance or regulation probably needs to identify a way for developers or residents to mitigate their impact to our water system. In other words, if we limit water or limit development because we feel like we don't have enough water, we will likely have to give developers a pathway to bring water to the table. And this is the dedication system that I was discussing. There are a lot of ways this can shake out. It can be that they're giving us water shares in an irrigation company. It can be that we exact like an impact fee that lets us go and buy the water ourselves. It can be that they just turn over like a physical well for us. There are a lot of different options, but whatever kind of, if we were talking about water restrictions, we'd have to provide some sort of avenue. And we would probably want to provide an avenue that protects our groundwater So it would be wet surface water we would be asking for. But that's going to be bigger discussions when we talk about a dedication ordinance. All right. So with that framework in mind, I don't know, sorry, this is not very big. Chuck, do you have this happened last time too.
I can pull it mine.
He can zoom his, I can't zoom.
Well,
the
we have
PowerPoint.
it in our packet, so
Oh, that's true too. Okay.
you can move through it, it's fine. Chuck,
All right.
I would just leave it as is, because folks that are watching on the YouTube
They can see
They
it
can-
just fine.
zoom in as they need to. Is that okay, council? Good?
Okay, so I know this work plan looks kind of detailed, and we're going to move through it pretty quickly. I just have a couple of highlighted action items that we wanted to talk about because they're new, and I think the most impactful things we can do for the next over the next year to 2 years. As you can see, it's divided into analysis, policy, and O&M. These are all just sort of it's a common way to divide up work, and we kind of treat them as like a little feedback loop that inform each other. But the ones that I wanted to highlight are first that it's under analysis, and it's bullet point A. One opportunity that we have is to participate in an ongoing research and monitoring efforts. These efforts include groundwater monitoring efforts, which I know Mike and I had a long discussion with the state engineer and some other stakeholders about groundwater monitoring that needs to happen. As well as a Mid-Valley hydrogeology research effort conducted with other government agencies. The purpose of this Mid-Valley effort is to better understand how all the different aquifers interact with each other, so that if we may find that drawing from valley fill is not feasible because it's too harmful to the deep Glen Canyon aquifer. And we certainly don't want to develop any other water resources without this kind of information because we might be having unintended consequences to our water portfolio. So that's why this information is helpful. It might either deem some sources as safe to develop and then others to say, sorry, just not developable. It'll help us understand our source options. The second, analysis B is another option that we're pursuing right now, and that's to conduct a needs assessment to determine current and future usage scenarios. This is something that's been asked, the council has been asking for some time, to basically understand our long-term demand needs, as well as our vulnerabilities to our system. So the purpose of this assessment, we would engage with the Western Resource Advocates. They've approached us about doing this. It's free. It's a lot of staff work to do it. But they have offered to offer some technical expertise as well. And we would just conduct this needs assessment that would identify like our local conditions, our local points of impact, and how we could take action. This is also really valuable work because what it can be is the foundation for why a water dedication system is called for. It's basically the rational basis for any water dedication system. And what would happen is someone challenges our ordinance and we say, listen, we did this needs assessment and this is what it says. We don't have much water, we can't afford to develop it. The water we do have is, too either, it's not resilient enough, it's too expensive to develop, it harms our other water sources. So it provide that whole picture for us to defend an ordinance. And then I can jump over, sorry, I've got a tickle in my throat, over to resource policy development. So under A there, this is the ordinance development and adoption that I was talking about earlier. I think my recommendation in the immediate future is to develop a water emergency or shortage plan. And especially with the fire situation, I think that's made this a really prominent need for this year. A dedication and exaction ordinance. Again, the needs assessment would inform this ordinance, and what we would do is engage with our water attorneys and some land use attorneys to help us craft that. And a third, which Mila is going to be talking about, is some landscaping standards that I think that are very valuable to our, not just our conservation efforts, but to our resource and management efforts generally. Conservation is important because it makes your system more resilient. I know that there's this perception that what it does is it's meant to like free up water for additional development, and I don't think that's entirely accurate. It just makes your system more redundant and more resilient. So it's actually about protecting the current demand, not opening anything up for new demand. And that's an important thing that we'll explore as we develop our conservation standards. And then, so B, under this policy prong, are conservation measures that need to target the city facilities, our residents, and our visitors. And the last half of this workshop is Mila talking about our conservation planning. I've observed too that sometimes when we talk about conservation and management, people think they're the same thing. One is a component of the other. So just education for vocabulary when we're talking about the two. Okay, and so item C under this is a valley-wide interagency coordination effort. We've spoken with Groundwater and with San Juan County, and they are on board with this effort. So what we would do is engage these other water providers and start aligning our practices and our philosophies with one another, because we realize that Groundwater has enough water rights in the aquifer to drain it completely without our help. So, not our help, but like our contribution to drawing from the aquifer. So if we are going to be restricting our water use to protect the aquifer, we need Groundwater in the county to do the same in order for it to be effective. And that's true. San Juan County also has an interest in the aquifer. So it makes a lot of sense if we all get on the same page and all agree to sort of take the same measures to preserve that groundwater supply. It's also just good information sharing to have because we have such an integrated, connected system. Knowing what one is doing might impact what kind of water resources we develop. And then bullet number D under policy is to organize a valley-wide water resource management plan. And I want Chuck to be able to talk a little bit about this. We've spoken with those water agencies as well, and they're excited to participate in this. Essentially, we would be signing an ILA together and contracting with a consultant using money that we already have from our water bonds that was issued this spring. And we're going to do a study on our water needs, understand where synergies exist, where conflicts exist, understand better their water demands and what options are available to our partners in the valley, and identify water either development projects, water conservation projects, and the like in this effort. So Chuck, do you want to, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Carly. So this is essentially an outline that we have vetted with the other intended participants, and they're in concurrence at this point. And this plan lays out who our intended coalition participants are. And it's the city, it's GWISA, it's the San Juan County Special Services District, and it's the Moab Irrigation Company. And those are the 4 large water providers, right? So we're not reaching out to federal agencies who aren't water providers, right? They certainly would be involved as stakeholders as the plan would move along, but the plan is specific to guide the water providers because that's really what the business that the city is in, and so is GWISA and the Special Services District. And that's what we're, this concern about looking at water as a resource comes down to water sources, distribution, and storage. So we think these are the key people to make an impact on water supply and delivery in the valley. And really, I think that's something that we started to think about this is it's the Moab Spanish Valley. I mean, the aquifer is, whether it's surface water, whether it's groundwater. In the flood control business, we used to say that water knows no political boundaries. The same way it goes with groundwater. And I think that's the intent of this, is to to work together. And we've loosely called it a coalition at this point, though that's just a word. The purpose is to develop and implement a water resource management plan for the valley, known as the plan. And the purpose, at least I didn't give it an acronym, huh?
Thank you. That's hilarious, though.
Yeah.
Let's call it plan.
Plan, yeah. The
So
plan,
that's super clear what we're talking about.
you know, I write this like a scope of work. That's the thing, I just out of habit. The plan purpose will be a document that's intended to ensure water availability for the residents and visitors to the valley for the next 100 years. So we have a pretty long window on that, and but it's maybe really long, and you know, the further out you get, the less clear the crystal ball is, but at least we're giving consideration to the further out, you know, with emphasis shorter in too. Plan elements and features, we'll consider ground, and by the way, all of the city's water supply right now, as I know council knows, is groundwater. We don't operate off of reservoirs. We don't operate off of surface water from the creeks or rivers. But that'll all be considered because those are potential sources. And as Carly said, we have an obligation to, I believe I'm paraphrasing it correctly, to at least consider those sources. And certainly the other providers use those sources. Ken's Lake is a reservoir. You know, Moab Irrigation Company pulls out of the creek. So the Special Services District is groundwater primarily. The coalition will consist of the 4 providers. Detailed scope of work will be established by the coalition, the plan produced by an independent consultant selected by them, funded by them, and under the management of them. So bring in an experienced third-party consultant who used to doing this kind of work so that it's not influenced unduly by any member of this group or any representatives of the group. We're going to maximize use of existing data and science. So in other words, this isn't part of the continued science and research that's, you know, has been going on vigorously, you know, in the last 4 or 5 years. There might need to be some, but for the most, we'll maximize. There's a lot of data that's out there right now, and I think we've coalesced. I agree with the state's interpretation of the 1,300 to 3,500 acre feet that's available. I think that's a good working number for us to move forward and make a lot of progress on this and not get wrapped around the axle on, well, is it really 1,300 or is it 1,100, you know, or is it 0? That lets us move forward on a plan. And, you know, it would include public engagement, costs for capital and maintenance, alternatives development with recommendations. You know, as you might say, well, what's an idea of an alternative? An idea of an alternative might be, let's take less of our culinary water and quit putting it on lawns as much as possible and find a way to take the secondary water, whether it's surface water from the creeks or whether it's valley fill aquifer, and use that for irrigation. I know it's not a Chuck original idea, it's been talked about, but that's just an idea of some alternatives that might be looked at. And it might not be comprehensive for the whole valley. There might be pockets of areas where it makes more sense than others. If we benefit and make sense, it's maybe something we should be doing in the future. It'll have an implementation schedule. We'll consider water rights, we'll consider legal implications, drought and climate change will be considered, and other things are going to pop up that we haven't thought of here, but those will be considered as well. But I think that's a pretty comprehensive list of trying to find direction forward. The deliverable, because I'm always big on, we always have to be, what are we going to get out of it? I know council always wants to know what that is too. We'll get, you know, all the support documentation, but ultimately it's going to be an implementation plan. That'll include scope, schedule, and costs for a recommended alternative or a series of alternatives. That'll include a project or series of projects that will ensure safe yield of groundwater in the valley is not exceeded. So we're being proactive in terms of heading off the safe yield designation from the state, if at all possible, because that has ramifications and it seems to be a good thing to do, while we ensure availability of water to residents and visitors in the valley for the next 100 years. It's a big implementation plan to look for, but I think it's achievable. Other things may come up, you know, just to include that. Like I said, I write it as a scope of work. The schedule, if we had a resolution of support for plan collaboration and funding commitment by the coalition in August, we'd start advertising. We could select a consultant in October. They would work with us between November and June of next year, and potentially as early as June, so a year from now, adoption of the plan by the local coalition governing bodies, such as yourself and the GWISA board and the San Juan Special Services. Again, this is to give us a valley-wide water resource management plan is the goal of this. So, sorry, thank you for letting me take the time, but I wanted to walk through that because it's very specific, we think, and let you know that we have a plan to move forward to address these needs. Carly, back to you.
Yeah. All right. So that's basically the outline of the plan I wanted to discuss this evening. The O&M part doesn't really need to be discussed because this is what we do during our capital budgeting process. So this would be our yearly discussions that we already undergo, but we wanted to include them because they're very important in the overall discussion and definitely a big prong of how we manage our water resources.
Well, and we're already doing the first, right?
Yes, we are. We're
Real quick,
implementing.
should we point out like where we are with O&M?
So we're
Present
implementing that bond package with some really great projects. I think it's money well spent. And obviously, Levi and his team is operating and maintaining the system. We're going to evaluate and optimize for system redundancy. This is actually kind of part of that valley-wide water resource management plan we were just talking about. So that would feed into our overall O&M strategy. Of course, we maintain our regulatory standing, we defend our water rights, we defend it at the legislature, and we'll make sure that we are meeting Safe Drinking Water Act requirements and other statutory requirements. And, each year we pass a budget with water rates in it. And so that's item E there, maintaining sufficient revenue streams. So already cooked into a lot of good governance and management is already happening, part of what we do all the time. So I wanted just to briefly go over some next steps so you guys know you can convey to the community what we'll be doing in the coming months, and you can expect to see it from staff as we meet here during our city council meetings. I think we want to pursue more with the state engineer the Mid-Valley hydrogeology research effort. You might be seeing I think they're going to be asking for funding. I'm not sure how much or how much we're willing to part with when it comes to that effort, but that will be a discussion. Obviously, we would need council approval to do that. We'll be conducting needs assessment. This is mostly a staff level effort. It's technical. It's going to be Mila and Chuck and me and Nora probably doing a huge amount of this work. Although I imagine there's going to be a public process component of it. There's like a stakeholder group they recommend that we convene to understand the needs assessment. And I think the Western Resource Advocates are ready to go pretty shortly with that. Yeah,
they should be giving us a scope of work
any day.
Would that not be the water board that you would have?
The water board would be involved too, because the water board is more conservation focused rather than what the needs assessment is going to say is like how much water do we have, when our build out, what does that look like? So it's that technical engineering kind of work that we would have to do. But as stakeholders, as doing QA and QC, I think the water board could fill that value, really a valuable contribution to it. And then, obviously, the valley-wide interagency coordination. I plan to set up a meeting with Dana and with Lloyd and Mac McDonald at San Juan County and reach out to Moab Irrigation Company, too. And we're going to have our first meeting and start planning a path forward. I anticipate regular meetings and then more intensive as we develop number 4 there, the valley-wide water resource management plan. That would be coming to council too, because obviously if we select a consultant and we need money, we need all of that approval from you. I imagine you'd also be part of the resource plan development. It'd be a public process, there'd be public engagement. And each of the bodies, I'm sure, want to be very involved in whatever projects are being either developed or pushed aside. It's probably going to look a lot like our infrastructure planning processes. And then finally, the thing that's going to take probably the most time is the ordinance development. So I'd recommend we get started on those three that I identified. Mila can talk more about this, but we have a grant to help with the landscape ordinance. Someone will be doing a ton of technical work for us on that. The dedication system will need to maybe wait for the needs assessment to finish, but after that we can engage with our water attorneys to start developing it. And then the water shortage contingency plan is also something that will be developed in close conjunction with council. It would come to you because you would be approving whatever plan we come up with in case of a water shortage. So that is the plan for the next month. And that's the end of my presentation. It seems like Mila is up, and then we can take questions at the end.
Thanks, Carly.
Summer's good.
I just press it once. And then double click
Are
on
you
that.
Windows or?
Yeah. Press
Up in the corner.
connecting to base unit.
I'll try pressing it, but let's see.
It says it's not quite there yet.
It's not yet.
There we go. Okay, ready to share? And then I double click?
Yeah.
Once or twice? Oh, once.
There you go.
Okay. Looks like we're good. All right. Oh. Okay. Is that good?
Good.
All right, perfect. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is actually our 5-year water conservation plan update, which is a state-required document. This is an opportunity for us to define our conservation goals, but it is actually fairly specific as far as what's required. This is pursuant to the Water Conservation Plan Act of 1998, and it requires every Utah water retailer and conservancy district to adopt a water conservation plan every 5 years and file it with the Utah Division of Water Resources. Non-compliance does result in ineligibility for state loans or funding, so it's certainly in our interest to be compliant. And the City of Moab's last plan was filed in 2016, so we're due for our update. The plans have a number of requirements, I think. Yes, so there's a checklist. A lot of the data included in the plan is actually pretty similar to what the city already files with the state. Is it every year? Right, yeah, every year. So the large portion of the beginning of that plan is kind of a summary of that data. I think our previous water conservation plan went into a little bit more detail on that. I think we don't necessarily need to, since we do file all of that information with the state every year, so that it would be duplicated. But the most important part, I think, for this plan is our conservation goals and also how we're going to get there. So essentially, the state has set, they've gone through a number of different iterations as far as water conservation goals over the years. What they've settled on recently are these regional conservation goals. They use a measurement of gallons per capita per day to set the goals, and that is including all types of water use. So that's permanent population and industrial, commercial, and residential and institutional water use. So, as you might imagine, that can vary quite a bit depending on, what the other water users are in the region, how much agriculture. It obviously doesn't include tourists or anything like that. So, our gallons per capita per day do include that tourist uses commercial water. In recognition of that, the state has set regional goals. We're included in this dark blue Southeast Utah region. Our 2015 average use across that region was 333 gallons per capita per day, whereas in 2015, and Moab was already at 282. The 2030 goal for our region is 267, which is a 20% overall reduction. However, that would only be a 5.4% reduction for Moab. So we discussed, Chuck and Carly and I and Levi discussed a new goal, and we came up with 230 gallons per capita per day by 2030, which also sounds really nice. And that is approximately a 20% reduction from 2015, which would be which would kind of level us out with that regional goal percentage-wise. That number wasn't pulled out of thin air. It actually equates to a 50% reduction in outdoor landscape watering, and accounts for increase in population. So if we reduced our outdoor landscape watering use by 50% from where it's at right now, then even including our new population, we would actually be using the exact same amount of water as we are now overall. That doesn't account for, a large increase in commercial water use or, anything else that we aren't necessarily knowing about right now as far as industrial use or anything like that. But it should be, I think it's a pretty good goal for the city in general, particularly considering the 20% reduction. One thing I want to say before we move on just about this metric is that it does rely on population estimates. We will get our 2020 census data in 2022. So there is, because we don't have that many people, just that, even a difference of 100 people could change where we're at according to these types of goals. So I think this is a great goal, and and then when we get our numbers in 2022, it'll allow us to refine it and update it based on those new population numbers.
Can you explain visitation as
right
well?
now we're from 2010. Yes, so I think the important thing to keep in mind about visitation is that overnight accommodations only use 16% of our commercial water use. So the large proportion of our water use in Moab is residential. So I think the increase in tourists over that 16%, we would have to have quite a few people increase to make that number change. So I think for now, we probably don't need to worry too much about it, considering we have a few million people and it's only 16% of our commercial water. But we're working with Elaine to get better data on our actual visitation numbers so that we can calculate a better metric. Because right now we mostly have data, those cell phone users and the room occupancy. So we don't necessarily have really specific numbers as far as people staying overnight. But that's something we're looking for.
How would you address that with the public? Because I think the perception is, just anecdotally, that hotels use far more water than homes do.
Tony, I told everybody not to ask any questions until the end. You didn't hear me, so you're forgiven.
I'm sorry.
Hold that
Ignore me.
We'll talk about it.
Thanks.
Okay, so the conservation measures that we have proposed are a large slate of options. I've divided them up into these 3 buckets of policies, programs, and investments. That's general categories. I'm going to go through the list really quick of just things that we've thought about and proposed, and this is in discussion with the Water Board and with city staff. And just keep in mind that in particular for the water conservation plan, these are intentions, they're not promises. So we aren't, held to them. There's no, penalty for not meeting these goals. These are, absolutely our best intentions and our plans. And so we can, kind of shoot for the moon if we want to. But I think that, and some of these are already underway. So first in the policy bucket is the landscaping ordinance. Carly was mentioning that earlier. This is something that we are going to pursue with the assistance of the Water Now Alliance. They are working with the Western Resource Advocates. Part of this $25,000 grant that we got is going to include that needs assessment as well that Carly was mentioning. They have worked with a few communities, also in Colorado, around here, also up in northern Utah, to do some of this work before, so they do have some good relevant experience. And we're hoping that they'll have something for us by around the end of the year. So this would be essentially water-wise landscape standards for all new development and redevelopment. And then we're hoping that it will be integrated with our gray water ordinance so that those two will work in conjunction. Which brings me to the proposed gray water ordinance. This is a possibility to require all new buildings to be stubbed for gray water and then integrated with landscaping. Hopefully Water Now will help work on this concurrently, and then they're not sure that they'd be able to finish that in the time allotted, but staff would be able to step in there. This is becoming more common. It's actually similar to a proposal that we just heard from regarding electrification of new buildings. So essentially it's easier for those things to just go in when everything is being constructed than it is to retrofit. And the health department is very supportive of that one. Another policy we've talked about is an emergency drought management plan. The idea here is to have already thought through all of the potentially really strict measures that we want to put in place, as well as any potential gaps, such as a secondary shutoff for irrigation systems, things like that we might be able to think about installing for the future, should the need arise when we would actually need to enact this plan. So we're not reacting. Development standards, so this would be changed to development standards to require new buildings to also have water-wise fixtures and use water as efficiently as possible. This is, something that I think Community Rebuilds, for instance, is already doing, and we would be able to, piggyback off of some of their ideas. Then in this bucket of programs, I separated them out from policies because they require some financial commitment. The first one that has been talked about quite a bit is the turf grass buyback. This is something other communities have done across the country. It's to incentivize conversion of lawn grass to more water efficient landscaping. In preliminary research, I've seen numbers between actually, I saw one as low as 50 cents a square foot, and then as high as $3 a square foot. So, it just depends on where that incentive really becomes effective. So that's an option.
Is that a grant? Is that what you mean by incentive? Can you explain it a little more?
Yeah. So this essentially, instead of there's a partial incentive
Cost
to
of watering,
transfer.
or do we give them money?
Right. We would give them money.
Okay.
So they would save the cost of watering, but then we would further incentivize that by actually paying someone to remove their lawn. And there are various ways to, kind of prove that or require something to be replaced, or, there's lots of ideas out there. But yes, that would be paying. Conservation rebates. This is something we're already partially accomplishing with the tiered rates that were adopted. This would be a further incentive to conserve. This is, possibility to set volumes by property size with allowances for things like agriculture, or just individual improvement. So, something like a rebate if your year over year or month over month is, improved by a certain percentage reduction. Distributing smart timers or moisture meters. These improve watering efficiency of any landscape, residential, commercial. You can save thousands of gallons a year per lawn. There are quite a few grants available for smart timers. Utah Water Savers also has a rebate program. And then some municipalities have started to purchase a whole bunch of them and then actually give them out to their water customers.
So Mita, what's the difference between a smart timer and a timer?
A smart timer is connected to a moisture meter or to a weather station, so it will only water when you need to. A moisture meter can be a separate thing where you actually have to look at it and decide what it says and when you want to water. So smart timers are really the ones that will take away the decision-making from the homeowner and really put it in the hands of technology, which can be really helpful. A leak penalty. Currently, we have a leak incentive, which is a rebate for water used due to the leak after the customer has fixed it. Public Works has suggested that some people really aren't motivated to fix their leaks particularly fast, especially depending on the size, or maybe the rebate doesn't really matter to them. And they've suggested that a penalty might help encourage more prompt attention to those problems. And then, of course, outreach and education. This gets to your question, Tani. Proactive outreach and education to encourage just a general water conservation mindset. I think, Carly mentioned a little bit about, and some of the overnight accommodations. There's a perception, I think a few different perceptions in the community that can be challenging in this regard. One is that, conservation will then just mean that we have more water for development. And the other is that, overnight accommodations and tourists are using all our water. And so, we shouldn't conserve. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to do more outreach, more education, get those numbers out into the community so that people understand that, it's not the tourists and that, we are really interested in the precautionary principle of conservation rather than just, opening up more water for development. We've been talking about mailings for some of these landscape ideas, making digital resources available and much more findable. And then there's a few different ideas as far as on the ground resources. USU has in the past offered water audits, so they'll have somebody come out and actually assess your system and tell you where you can improve. Landscape consultations, and then we've talked a little bit with Public Works about the possibility of some kind of very friendly door hangers for properties where the city has noticed, lots of water running down the street or really inefficient watering or puddles or something like that. Hey, we'd love to come help you out and make your system more efficient. And then we are currently writing articles about water and trying to get that out into the community as well. There we go. So last category was investments, and this is sort of like larger city investments in city property. The city watering in general, this is really just they're all mostly lead by examples, this would reduce outdoor city water use. We've talked a little bit with Annie about that in the parks. Again, implementing the smart timers and moisture meters. Sounds like there's some opportunities to improve our watering efficiency. I think we could probably cut the grass a little higher. There are some places where some of the grass isn't necessarily needed or in places that's not used as much. And then there are some plants and trees that could be replaced and more efficiently irrigated. And then reduce indoor city water use. This would require exchanging all of our fixtures, which is another option. And then our capital improvements that Carly and Chuck have talked about already. So we're already doing some of this, which is great. Improve efficiency, reduce some of the risk of catastrophic leaks, and then continuing our sustainable supply development. We already have the 5-year bond in that list of projects, and then like Chuck said, the secondary irrigation system dream is another down the road possibility. So as far as where we go from here, our water conservation plan draft is due to the state this month for review. And they are, just mostly looking at that checklist, so they'll give us some feedback on that. And then since we don't need to adopt it until the end of the year, we have enough time for 1 or 2 city council meetings to discuss some of the details. And then we can implement our conservation measures as we proceed from there.
So Mila,
Yes.
Hold on, are we all done?
Yes.
Okay. Hold on, we got a lot of questions. I'll let you-
draft plan, this is real quick, the draft plan is in the packet. Can I,
The draft plan is in the packet.
can I edit that? I mean, can I comment on it directly and as a way of reviewing it?
Sure. That would be fine.
That's
Yep.
what I asked.
So I think what I'm hearing from Mila, what I just heard, which is, I think, important for all of us to hear, is that she just proposed to us the draft that's going to the state, but then she is going to bring it back to council for another council meeting where we'll then be able to submit comments and questions, and we'll be able to refine it and then finalize it by December.
So you don't want us to review this one, you want us to review another one?
No, this is it. This is the one to review.
fine.
Oh, that's what I asked.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I can never mind.
But it'll be on an agenda for official feedback. So you don't have to email her comments, like, she's gonna get official feedback from us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, thank you both. Those were like super thick and detailed, all things water, like a tall glass of water. And I'm sure each of us have been scribbling notes and have like questions and comments and things. So I think the best way to structure this is just for the 3 of you to just stay put, and we can kind of popcorn questions and comments. And does that sound okay to all of you? Okay, in no particular order. You want to shoot first?
No, I really want to hear what, because I'm familiar with all this.
Right.
So I'd like to hear what their questions are.
Well, I'll start with one. I'm curious where, since there's sort of an average water use for the southeast, or was it the upper Colorado River Basin, whatever zone we are in, that assigns a sort of average use and the conservation goal by the state. You know what I mean? And so it sounds like Moab is lower than our use is already lower than the average. And I'm wondering where is higher? And it seems like just looking at, it seems like we may have better water, or at least groundwater resources than many other places in southeastern Utah. And so it occurs to me that they might be, if their use is also higher, they might also benefit from more conservation. And so if Moab City conserves more aggressively, it's sort of like we're pulling more than our weight, and there may be other places that may actually be subject to more drought and climate stress that should, and so I'm just wondering if we're pulling more than our weight, but they should actually, like, for their water security, be doing more.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I don't know what the impetus was for the state to divide those conservation goals up geographically, except they seem to do that on lots of things, you know? And I think to your point, I don't think you're making the point that we're doing too much, but it's more that it would be good if those others would do more. And I think that part of that has been this historic perception, just my opinion, but being in the water business for a couple of years, is that we haven't taken it seriously as a resource that needs to be managed. And I don't mean we, the city, or we as individuals, but I think maybe statewide it's been, hey, there's lots of water here, let's just use it because we like using it. And it does all these great things. We boat on it, we fish on it, we bathe in it, you know, we have these great lawns here, there, and yon. And I think there's this recognition that it's a limiting resource. And now I think that the good thing is this is a small valley, right? I mean, I think we can get a grip on what we're doing better than what we're doing. Not that we don't have a grip, but a better grip in a relatively short time, as Carly's outlined there. But the other places, it's going to be more difficult, so I think they may have marched more slowly into it, some of those goals. That's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, and I also think that, the other water systems are not, the other parts of our region are not necessarily connected to our water system either. So we have the opportunity, to basically be our own wonderful green bubble if we want to. Blue, I guess.
Okay, so I've got a couple of things. First is I shared a white paper with all of you that was published February 2021 that talks about whether or not we actually should be depending on Colorado River. And so as kind of like a backup water source. So I just feel like that's a really important message for us to be hearing, especially as in the plan, like it seems like Colorado is a backup. I'm not sure that we should consider Colorado as a backup for us based on the data that's coming out today. That's just a comment. You don't have to, respond because I know that it's a question, but I mean, it's not like a bunch of hippies saying, no, the Colorado's going to dry up. It's like USU's College of Natural Resources, Colorado River Division that's been analyzing the data of the, upper basin area. So I just, it's heartbreaking to me as a boater to think that the Colorado would dry up. And so I know there's going to be fierce protections for the river, but at the same time, the reality of depending on the Colorado as a secondary water source seems troubling to me as well. So I just wanted to make that comment. And I'm hopeful that there's, like you were saying, Chuck, there's a lot of data that's already been collected. And I just don't, when I was running for mayor, I was sitting in USGS meetings, writing in my little notebook the, reports and data of what was happening and how we needed to be acting on water data that was coming out, and that was 4 years ago. And so it's exciting to think that we're talking policy. I just don't want to get stuck in the analysis paralysis. I want to really implement policy as quickly as possible as we move along with this management plan. And I don't know if the council feels that way or not, but I feel like Karen said many times, do we have to study this again or can we just act? And I think we know that the measures that you have presented are low-hanging fruit policies that we can go ahead and implement. So I don't want to wait until next year spring to then be looking at policy. I'd rather just dive right in right now. I don't even want to wait until we submit it in December. I'd love to just get going on policy now because there are other communities that have samples that we can utilize to be able to move forward with policy. So I wanted to say that. And then the final thing is that between the two plans, it seems like, so I was kind of doing when I was reading them and when you were presenting, I just wanted to be really clear that the policy recommendations on the work plan draft are similar but not aligned as the policy plans for the state, but they're really close. So I didn't know what was better to edit, but it might be nice. So in your plan, you've got conservation measures, and you've got landscaping, but you didn't include gray water or the emergency drought management plan or the development standards. But it was more conservation measures. So I'm wondering if we could align both documents so that we don't have any policy question of where we're moving forward, the direction from council. So it was pretty clear in your conservation plan, we've got the 4. So maybe we edit yours to just say, to mirror those instead of the A and B. Like just join them together to mirror what we're sending to the state. And from what I'm hearing, it's landscaping, gray water, the drought management plan, and then water-wise development standards.
I think that's totally fine. Just ours are different in terms of time scale. So the work plan is what's going to happen in the next 1 year to 18 months. Hers is a 5-year. So maybe that's what's kind of confusing. We're probably going to, like gray water standards comes next year, but like water-wise and the dedication ordinance comes immediately. Does that make sense? I mean, we can merge them. We're just like, I think they're time scale.
Well, so back to the first thing I said, like, let's just get going on this policy. Like, we know regardless, like, we know because of all the data, and we know because we're having this conversation, that the council does want to move forward with water-wise policy. And we have talked about these different things over the past 4 years. So why not just move forward with them, align them in the plans? So instead of under conservation measures, just put conservation policy measures and list what Emila's plan says, you know what I mean? And then it's real clear, like, this is what we're doing, this is what we're working on. Because, there's also like, something that wasn't mentioned at all in either presentation, but has been mentioned a lot in the community, is whether or not Moab Irrigation Company would actually meter their irrigation water. And that wasn't said, and maybe because it's not our water to measure, but at the same time, that's the irrigation water used in the city. It's just not our water rights. But if we're talking about that as like we talked about the Colorado water, we talked about surface water, and that's Moab Irrigation Company as our secondary irrigation water, then we do need to look at that as a strategy, the metering Moab Irrigation Company water. But yeah, maybe it's not appropriate for these plans, but at the same time, that way we as council can say, all right, well, these are the 4 things that we're working on. It's concrete, and we can actualize those and then build upon those. So we could even say those 4 and then other conservation measures. You know what I mean? To like catch, if we're gonna, as part of this collaborative work with Moab Irrigation Company to meter, because the other resource that we don't get to enjoy as much anymore is recreation and splashing in Mill Creek, because it runs dry because Moab Irrigation Company isn't metering. So I guess those were kind of the things that stood out, but I should probably finish by saying, like, great work, great work. Like, this is definitely what we've been hoping to look at as a council, I think, at least for me, for almost 4 years. And it really feels refreshing to have things in writing. And I'm really excited and hopeful that before the end of this year, this council gets to celebrate some of these actualize some of these conservation policy options that you've put forward. Because again, landscaping, gray water, emergency drought management plan, and water-wise development standards, that's doable. And it'll just, it'll take work, but it's doable, regardless of any additional data we collect. And that'll feel good. Even if it means we're doing more than our neighbor, I'm encouraged to do as much as we can so that we never have to have the conversation about pulling from the Colorado. Those are some of my notes.
We could talk for a long time. So I want to hear from the other folks.
So I had a question. Carly, you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that we've had explosive growth, and then yet the census with our full-time residents, because I was looking at the census, we haven't really moved that much, and so it feels like there's we're not in tandem with what is happening with our residential population. The 16%, I had just a question as to when that was assessed for hotels, because when we did our moratorium for hotels. At that time, the discussion was that we were going to have 50% more hotel rooms when we instituted that moratorium. So,
Yeah, that's actually from this year's data. So that's just a calculation based on hotels.
2020, sorry.
Yeah, 2020.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Calendar year 2020.
Yeah.
So I actually had the same question, that I'm really glad that you brought that up. Can you just tell us more of the methodology of coming up with the 16%?
We look at the bills. We get all the accounts from the treasurer's office, and we just look at them, and, the city has a lot of facilities. We're one of the largest water users in the city, is the city government. And, we have, we don't really disclose everybody's names, but we just look at go by business licenses and say, these are the meters and these are the volumes. And then that's where we calculate the number. So that's coming from actually looking at the accounts.
Can we get like a pie chart that shows like how much is resident, how much is, because we like pie charts.
Mark would love to do that.
Residents, because we could do like resident and non-residential, but you're isolating overnight accommodations as 16. Residential is how much? And then government is probably a slice, and then,
Yeah, we can easily do all
Other-
that. We had it.
or
right?
restaurant, or.
That's in the draft plan in your packet.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we pull it up?
My
So it's looking at bills, so it's real time.
Okay.
16% overnight accommodations is real time. But, visitors also dine out, that's water use. Visitors wash their clothing in laundromats, that's use. They come in and they wash their cars, they rent UTVs, they get rinsed like daily. So there's more than just staying in a hotel that's water use.
Yeah.
So the 16% was like, that didn't feel right to me either. So let's just look at the pie chart real quick, or the chart. Dongling?
Well, no, it's just not connected to the internet, and it won't let me open anything.
Chuck, can you?
I think I can. Well, what I can do is go to the,
It still just says it's connected.
Yeah, well, Emily, for what it's worth, I remember Rosemarie quoting that same number.
Oh,
Yeah, and that may be where Mila got it from, maybe.
no, they said they calculated it this year based on the treasurer's.
And it seems to me in order to turn it into a comparable number for residents, you'd have to know the number of rooms in a hotel, their average occupancy rate, the average number of people staying in each room, and so forth. You've got to normalize it all. You understand that. You and I talked about that before, because I had a volunteer resident who was happy to do that, and then all of a sudden you showed up, and I said, have a good time. So
While they're looking, Karen,
Did you
one of
find-
us, your growth question is a really good one, and I think it's, maybe this will help answer like the paradox. It's growth not just for the city, but like the county and San Juan County. So, while our numbers are sort of stagnant, since we have a shared water system, if there's growth in the valley, it's concerning. I'm thinking of USU,
Right.
thinking of the development of 313, and what San Juan County has planned. It's like that growth that is so concerning. Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
because in the projected population growth, it doubles by 2060,
Residential, commercial.
and then,
but that's just
to get
resident.
to Emily's, that action, starting action plans, it feels like after Water Now Alliance does,
Their needs assessment.
their needs assessment, and then they're gonna start helping write ordinances, is that
Yeah,
correct?
we
Okay,
have
so
a
then
grant for them
that's-
to write the ordinance for us. And
Okay.
then they'll tailor it with us.
There we go.
for
And then,
this.
so that's just a couple months,
Yeah.
right?
I think
So,
yeah.
okay.
Emily, is that, Mayor,
Couple of
is
months
that gonna be
away.
enough? Is that quick enough?
That's September. Sure, but I mean, are they gonna also do building standards and drought
We have them
management
for
plan?
landscape.
You're talking about water.
Yeah, water now.
They're
and
just
gray
doing
water.
They're just
landscape.
doing landscaping.
So we can
basically-
look at building standards, like we can do a,
So it's a grant that's, it's $25,000 worth of technical assistance, so it's a certain number of hours that they're giving us. So I've asked them to potentially do all three of those things, building standards, gray water, and landscaping. And they will work up until they are done, essentially, with their time. So there is a possibility that they could end up working on some of those other things as well. And I have, they're gonna give us their scope of work. They're supposed to give it to us in mid-July, so any time now. And I did talk with them about, we would prefer to have as much of the technical information as possible versus wordsmithing an ordinance, for instance. So I'm hoping that we will be able to have that as part of their project as well. And they usually estimate it's about 6 months of work that they can provide. So that's where the end of the year is from.
I have a question that kind of dovetails with this, and that is, I'm under the impression that local government and building authorities are limited in terms of having standards that are higher than the building code. And so I'm wondering, would requiring water-wise fixtures, interior, as opposed to...
Go higher, we can't go lower.
Well, I'm under the impression we can't impose more restrictive standards than what the building code allows.
We can be more restrictive, we can't be less restrictive.
I think a bunch of contractors might differ.
I think it depends on what the specific issue is.
So
I think that there's an ability to do water-wise fixtures.
okay, so let me ask a follow-up question, since I presume that we're justifying it in terms of what our conservation needs. Energy Star appliances can also save significant amounts of water. So I'm wondering if that could also be rolled into these standards, which would then sort of circumstantially also advance other city goals.
That's a great idea, yes. And I was just going to say that, sometimes I think it's also, if we run up against issues like that where there are, it's not possible to go that far, it's always possible to put in incentives. So, and make it voluntary, but make it absolutely worth somebody's time to do it, or
Right.
money to do it.
But I also wonder if it's also an opportunity to have a conversation with the state and say, look, these don't actually cost more, it's just a choice that the builder makes, but it advances the goals that have been outlined by the state.
I'm pulling up state code right now. I'm going to read to you where it says that we can do a higher.
So that's for new construction. While you're pulling that up, what's interesting, in a lot of other places, we'll have programs to take the 20-year-old washing machine out of your house by letting you get a $200 rebate, if you turn it in, and buy an Energy Star efficient appliance so there's two tracks, right? There's a new development plus there's the existing, and I think that's part of what I like about part of the conservation plans, it seems to address both. Mm-hmm. While the mayor's looking, I just thought.
Well, and this might be a good research project for Lori. Because I'm going to read from what I think is Utah code. It's probably better coming from you than from me, whether or not we can actually regulate to a higher standard than Utah, than the UCC in the state of Utah, if the state allows us to do so.
Yeah, I'm happy to look into that.
Does ring a bell, though, Caitlin, what you're saying. I can't remember exactly what would be prevented, but we should look into that.
Mayor, this is Ronnie. I just didn't know. Whenever's good, I just had a bunch of questions.
Ronnie, we're ready for you. And I'm sorry I forgot about you. I'm so sorry. Welcome.
Oh, it's okay. So these kind of run the gamut for different people. I think this is initially one maybe for you, Carly. When we initially met about the water work plan, there was some discussion about, obviously you want your coalition to be water providers, and so that makes sense that we have the list of players that we do. But there was the question of how and where local government plays a role, like to what extent should council or commission members be involved, especially on the county end, because we have GWISA, and granted they're not notified to the county council, but to what extent might the county council members need to be informed? And I'm thinking, obviously, when you look at the watershed, it's a slightly different issue, but I mean, just in terms of staying informed, there might be some benefit to folks in Castle Valley, at least knowing what's happening. And so at what level is there a possibility for someone, say, from City Council, County Commission, Castle Valley Town Council, to sit on some level of that work plan development? I mean, I would think they don't necessarily need a vote, but just to stay informed, because there was some discussion, like at the county, there's some policies that are developed where it helps them to be informed. And I would think for us at the City Council level, there's value. I mean, imagine on the city level, Mike is involved, so that helps us. But I wasn't sure about where we kind of left it with Grand County, to whatever extent Castle Valley.
That's a really good question. I think we envision for the water resource management plan development that electeds are involved, whether it's just, two of you attending those meetings, as well as the overall plan would have to be adopted by the city council. And Ronnie, you're right that we had an open-ended question about whether the county serves on that board or we just keep them apprised like they're a really important stakeholder, because we might need them to have their own development code and similar standards as to what we're developing. And I think what we would, during that primary meeting, understand what GWISA can and can't do as that district. So it would be some fact-finding, and perhaps GWISA would be very interested in that because their powers are quite limited, or they might have a lot of authority when it comes to their water provision, where they could do it single-handedly. But the best policy path is the one you've identified, where the commission is quite involved to make sure it's all integrated and aligned with each other's values and vision. So the short answer is I would intend on including them extensively.
Okay, yeah, I guess my request would just be early on that we're having some kind of dialogue with whether it's the commission chair or the mayor of Castle Valley, just so they know that we're doing this, and then, however the layout plays out, but just so they get a heads up as courtesy from, early on. I was wondering, with the coalition members, do we have any idea yet, since they're going to be asked to put some funding in, how much money that might entail?
And is that for the water resource management plan? Was that your question?
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's like $100,000 to $150,000 is what we had in mind, and it would be a negotiation to decide how that's split. We do have money in the bond to cover a significant share of it. So the good news is there are funds available exactly for this kind of work, and I know Groundwater and San Juan both have offered to say, yes, we are happy to pitch in for it.
Okay, so on the city's end, we don't have to be adding to our budget plans. Okay, because we got the bond. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And then I was just going to ask you and Mila and Chuck, just like the slides you guys have shown tonight, can you send those out to us? Only because I was looking at, I too was interested in those goals for the water conservation regions, and it was just a little bit hard for me to make out details or numbers that on that DNR slide. So is that something you guys can send out?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then I think there was some discussion, and this might be too early, so you guys can tell me if it's too early to ask this question, but when we talk about reducing landscaping water use by, say, 50%, I imagine there are different ways to interpret that, and I know different communities around the country have dealt with it differently, but, there's some models where they just tell every single user, we want to see you reduce by 50%, but that doesn't seem to be a good model, because in some cases, have people who are being admittedly wasteful right now and other people who are just being very, very careful right now with what they're doing. So is there anything we can say just as a reassurance to those people who might be listening now who are very, very careful about how much water they use, that, it's not like we're going to tell you you have to cut your existing use by 50%, because that might frankly not be possible if you're already watering very little.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think, it's a community 50% and not an individual 50%.
Okay, great. Let's just see, sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but is it possible, or what do you guys recommend as we discuss these different scenarios and developing things, to maybe either put together a Google document where we can send you questions we're hearing in the community about water, so we could do some kind of frequently asked question educational materials, just because from obviously the questions you guys raised tonight, there's always the one about, are visitors using more water than residents? And that one, I feel like we can't go over that one enough, because, even sometimes those of us who listen to it and it makes sense, then you really start to question it the next day. So, but some of the other questions that I just feel like I'm getting include anything from, could the state force us to start using Colorado River water? And what would that look like, and who would be paying? Let's see. Sorry, I'm just looking at some other random things. Is there more proactive stuff we can be doing? Because, some people really have that sense that the state wasn't maybe as cautious or smart as it should have been, say, in the example of the Cedar City area or other areas that have over-allocated. And how do we make sure that they don't just, draw us along for years to the point where we over-allocate? So, just some reassurance questions, but also, I think people are interested in the tools that we have legally to push a little bit harder. Let's see, and I think they're also concerned about, it's often considered a really bad move to give up culinary freshwater, to say that we have in place of, I know some people have suggested, okay, well, the city could give up some of its water and just use river water instead, and then trade that water to someone else in the valley. And I just think there is some concern among people, but that's usually the last thing you want to do. So anyway, I think there are, just some concerns and questions about whether that's something, this might be a legal question, that the city can be forced to do down the line. And then just last things were, if somebody can explain, the term secondary water systems always gets thrown out there, especially upstate, but I think a lot of people don't really understand, myself included, what all that entails. So if somebody, and maybe it gets confused sometimes with systems and meters, but sometimes it gets very confusing about where that water is really coming from. Like if you actually were using gray water instead of culinary water, would that in effect be secondary? Is it only secondary if it's not coming from the culinary? So if somebody could just take a section, a moment to explain that, that would be great. And I guess that's it. Thank you.
Yes, so Ronnie, two comments, I guess. If you were to, it's a lot easier to answer questions than it is to answer assertions. So if you sent us questions, or the public sent us questions, we'll make every effort to try and answer them. That's great, but sometimes when people will state facts that aren't questions, it seems like we're being argumentative. We want to answer questions, so I would welcome questions of the sort that you were just talking about. That'd be great. That was one thing. And then to answer your last question about secondary water systems, yeah, it's the non-culinary water. It's the water essentially that's used for irrigation, primarily. That's the purpose. All the gray water systems are used for. I'm not aware of any other uses besides irrigation. And in some places, and we don't have this here, and I'm not suggesting we should have it here, but other places have them. They have 2 meters. I mean, to the mayor's comment earlier about Moab irrigation meters, and not to delve into that, but some places have if we had a secondary irrigation system, whether it was in neighborhoods that were close to a creek, close to Moab irrigation, or wherever it might be, that it's potential to put in a secondary irrigation meter. But we don't have them right now, and we're not suggesting that's a priority, but it's a possibility.
But it could be with new construction.
Absolutely.
That we require all new construction to have certain design criteria.
That's right.
One of which would be at least a backflow preventer and all irrigation running from that, so it would be easy enough to switch to a secondary.
Yeah, and we've had questions about that from local contractors in the last couple of months. So people, non-government regulated, are considering it for their own purposes. So yeah, that's to answer your question directly. Secondary water is irrigation water.
So I don't know if you guys know, but the county already requires a secondary water connection on new construction as long as you're reasonably close to a place where the irrigation water might come from. They're way ahead of us in that regard.
I did find, so just below the Utah code that you cited for the other section of the plan, and I sent you the link to double verify, but it does say that it's an exception that municipalities can regulate certain standards. But like,
Okay, sorry, oh,
do you have more, Ronnie? I'm sorry, I thought you were done.
oh, sorry, no, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just, one more than connected question, and maybe it's already answered and I'm being slow, but, so I'm guessing though, the only reason that one pursues secondary water is if one is in a situation where one has alternate supply, and for a lot of communities that's not going to be the case, right? So I mean, you would only if you have alternate water source, then it might be something you looked at. But if you know you aren't going to have a viable source that's going to serve many people, then it's a moot question, right?
I think that Ronnie's making a really good point, because when you're saying, well, what if we bifurcate, like in the plan? It's like, well, okay, let's say we bifurcate. That's only if we have a secondary source. And so does that mean Moab Irrigation Company? No. Would that mean Ken's Lake?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. Would that mean Colorado River? I don't love that.
I know, but maybe. In the realm of possibilities, it's out there.
Or
Same way,
Valleyfield would be another option.
Or what?
Valleyfield Aquifer.
Valleyfield.
Valleyfield, the salty stuff.
I mean, and I'll say this not to open up this, but in other places.
Are you opening up a?
Yeah, no. There's reclaimed water. There's maybe someday, and I'm not saying now, there's a potential for certain activity from our wastewater treatment plant. There may be opportunities in the future, because other places do that, for secondary irrigation. We're not capable of doing it now, but
Mountains do it for snow.
yeah, maybe someday we could.
Like,
So,
Flagstaff actually utilizes that for snow, much to the chagrin of the native
So may I,
population.
Can I just make one comment about the Colorado River water? I've actually talked to the guy that wrote the book about that in New Mexico. He's a professor at University of Albuquerque. I think his name it's John, is it Fleisch or something like that? Anyway, he specifically about Moab and our allotment of Colorado River water, and in his opinion, we should develop it. Which was really interesting from an ecologist conservation perspective. And what he was saying was that our allotment is so small that it actually becomes more of an equity issue, and that our conserving or not using it will make absolutely no difference to the entirety of the Colorado River. And he thought that there was no reason for us not to strongly consider using our portion.
Except just the reason is
another-
that whether or not it
that
would
one.
even be there.
Yes,
in
that's a separate
15
thing.
or
And-
20 years, once we
right.
have
And-
infrastructure in place to, all right, we've bifurcated, we've got our pump, we've got our big straw, and now you can walk across the Colorado because there's not enough CFS to even pump in the, at all.
And if I may, because I'm just curious, because in our 30,000 acre feet allotment, I mean, the state is including the Colorado River. I mean, do we get a choice to say, no, we don't want to use it? I mean,
So we don't have a water right now in the Colorado River. The city does not. It's Groundwater, San Juan, and then the Department of Energy. And that's what makes up that 10,000 acre feet. So it wouldn't necessarily be a question of us developing necessarily Colorado River water. It's on the table. We could file a change application and do it. What we're more interested in is understanding the consequences of if Groundwater develops their allotment, which is totally approved right now, and they're very interested in pursuing. for secondary, for irrigation, not for culinary use. So the consequence of it drying up is that you don't get to water a lawn, rather than you have to close down your house or close down your business, right? What implications that might have for the larger water system. For example, they wouldn't have to maybe pull so much from Kins Lake, and there might be water now flowing through Mill Creek because they're supplementing it with the Colorado River, which is a much healthier. It's like 4 million, acre feet of water flowing through our system every year, and we're not using any part of that right now to supplement and make our other systems much more resilient and healthy.
So, question. So we drilled a hole back in the day called Faux Falls that then takes the Mill Creek water that is our water, the city, right? We have the rights to the city, not Gwissa?
We have some, and Gwissa has some.
Gwissa has some. So are we metering the amount that flows through Faux Falls and then fills the Kens Lake?
We don't meter it, but it's metered. Yeah, we know, Gwissa, it's on the USGS gauge. Yeah, there's an allotted amount that they can pull out
Of Faux Falls.
on a daily basis from the Mill Creek. Yeah, they're limited to a certain amount.
And that's measured and monitored, and so they're not pulling out any more? So is there I didn't know there was a close-off for Faux Falls.
Oh, yeah, there is.
And they
There's a
turn it
valve
off?
right there. You bet.
So they only take what is their
When there's-
paper water right?
Yeah, up to that amount. And if there's more wet water, like 3 years ago, when it was the last wet year, wasn't it? I think it was 19. They had all the water that they had. They closed it because the reservoir was full. Kens Lake was
Yeah,
full.
that was rare.
It is rare. I'm not predicting it. I'm just saying though.
They really like super wet years because once they get over a certain flow in Mill Creek, they don't pay any money. They normally have to pay money to Moab Irrigation Company to chuck water into Kins Lake when it's down below a certain level. But once it gets above, 6 or 8 or 10 CFS, something like that, it's free. It was a great year, but it doesn't happen very often. It's usually the opposite.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they
And-
turn it on and off, the valve on.
Oh, yeah.
That's why Faux Falls isn't on all the time.
So would it be possible then for, if they're looking to improve their landscaping for the valley, to do the big straw from the Colorado and we turn
Yeah,
Faux
but it's
Falls off
really
forever?
expensive, Emily. I mean, it's a big deal to pump. Right now, irrigation water, they assess a surcharge to all their Kins Lake users whenever they have to pump it, because the pumping costs are the dominant part of the cost. The water is relatively free, but the pumping cost. And they have a big time, they got a couple thousand feet. I don't know, maybe not that much, Chuck.
Maybe 1,500, something like that, yeah.
To get it up to Kins Lake. Just so you guys will know, while I got the floor real quickly, Moab Irrigation, I sit on the board, they are completely in the dark about what we're talking about here. I keep bringing this up and it just goes right over the top. Those guys are consumed with valves and 150 users and so forth, and who's paying their bills and all that, and they are not looking into the future. They might. I keep bringing it up. But just so you guys will know, there's 3 diversions up in the mountains. There's 2 big hay farms, one on Wilson Mesa, one on South Mesa, that are big users. There's a big bed and breakfast right off the Loop Road. I wish I could remember the name of it.
Whispering Oaks?
Yeah. There's farms on all the way down the valley. And here in town, there's 100 and some odd users. I'm one of them, for example, that have everywhere. I own 2 shares, for example. It's nominally 4 acre feet per year of water that I get delivered per share. And the reason I do it is because it's a lot cheaper than city. If I were trying to water my 1 acre lawn with city culinary water, it would be really expensive. Which brings me to my turf grass question. Does crabgrass qualify? But anyway, I mean, all this is possible. I just want to warn you guys, it's not a panacea, all right? Most of this water is already in use as irrigation water someplace. If you want to appropriate it for city users, then somebody's going to have to give it up, all right? They only get 3 CFS. I mean, basically, that's what the BLM requires coming down from Kins Lake. And that's why you oftentimes see it in the summer diverted completely out at the dams over on the east side of town, because they're using it all. And if we had a lot of automated dams and fancy stuff like that, we could do a lot better job of distributing it, and maybe we could leave a little bit of water in the creek here in town all the time. But it doesn't come cheap. We're talking about serious money to, because right now the whole thing is ran pretty much the way it was 100 years ago. I mean, everything's closed in now, but it's still a bunch of manual valves and people flood their lawns and they don't do anything fancy. Okay.
How much are we losing through evaporation by the open canals and?
Depends on what they do with it. If you flood irrigating your lawn, some people do that. Probably evaporation losses are pretty small, okay, because you don't spray it. But people that sprinkle, it's a bigger deal. That's why they try to encourage you to do, well, no, we try to encourage people to water at night, like I do, for example, because I'm on a timer, not a smart timer. But yeah, whenever you sprinkle it into the air, there's more that's lost to evaporation.
It can be up
Mike,
to-
what are your thoughts about the plans?
I was just gonna say, it could be up to 25.
Thoughts about,
25%
Plans.
remains?
oh, the plan?
Yeah, because you haven't said anything about
The plan is fine. We'll talk about it later on. As a general rule, I'd like to see us more aggressive. I'm still seeing, my main complaint is not the city, it's the Division of Water Rights, because we have an impending finite limit of water that we're going to use, okay? And we're still basically, I mean, one of the last things Mark Stilson said was, you remember that 1,500 to 2,500, 3,500 acre feet number that he quoted out? You want to know where that comes from? That comes from the original USGS plan. The vast majority of the water that comes out of the aquifer is Mill Creek water, or what they call subsurface outflow groundwater that's in the lower valley just above the river. And neither one of those are directly accessible, really. They're not really. And so I asked Mark at the very last meeting, just before you showed up, Carly, about how they would get that water. And he said, oh, we don't get it directly. He encouraged the city to drill still another well and see if it decimated the groundwater in the wetlands or not. To me, that's not a proactive approach, okay? I would rather, we've got a lot of science in front of us, and right now, all too often, Mr. Stilson, whom I have a world of respect for, don't get me wrong, is ignoring him because he doesn't understand it, he doesn't want to believe it. He would rather just keep on doing. He would rather just keep on punching holes in the ground and let the water rights holders fight it out. And to me, I would rather use the good science. We've got good science that says that the portion of the culinary water and so-called deep, this is the controversial part of the plan. There's a so-called deep aquifer that USGS has identified as being chemically present in the Hyla Sols, and that same water showing up at our springs and wells, and it doesn't show up anywhere else. That's why he thinks he's going to assign it to this particular channel. But you can't see it. There's no direct proof of it. It sounds a little, because nobody's seen it before, Mark doesn't really want to sign up to it. He doesn't dispute it. But anyway, so we don't have to do all that, but the other main point I want to put out, which Carly has touched on, is that we're still leaving one era here, and I think Chuck would agree with this, of easy, cheap water. Okay, and all these things that we've talked about here all can be done, but they're all going to be complicated. There's going to be a lot of reservations. There's going to be a lot of infrastructure, and water is sure to get more expensive, and I don't think Carly would disagree with that. But there are no easy answers here. Okay.
Thank you for your thoughts on that. I heard you, Ronnie. It's 6:46, so maybe last comments. Yep.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say briefly how much I respect all the work Mike's done on this, and he definitely has my support. And you were asking earlier if we were ready for action, so I would just put in my 2 cents for action and seeing stuff as soon as possible. And I'm definitely one of those people who's really interested in the ordinance that deals with bringing wet water to the table. So anybody can approach me if I can be of any extra assistance with that. But my last question was, when we met about just to discuss the water work plan and stuff, and to better, one of the things I've been trying to better understand is equal protection. And I know I have some residents who will ask me, like, okay, well, if water gets tight, some other communities like Oakley, have been saying, okay, well, don't worry, community, we're going to make sure the residents have water first. And but I just wanted to reiterate, maybe with Lori or maybe Mila or Chuck can answer this, that my understanding under equal protection is some people have asked me like, oh, okay, well, if water got tight, could we only allocate water, say, to affordable housing projects, or could we only allocate water to housing for primary residential users? And my understanding under equal protection, if I understand that part right, is that you have to treat everybody the same. So whether you had a new gas station that wanted to come on, who was allowed to do that in your zone, or somebody who wanted to build affordable housing, you have to offer water equally to those two users. But I wanted to make sure that I was understanding that right, because I know it's a question some residents have had too. So if somebody just wants to tell me if that's right or wrong, that'd be great.
So Ronnie, this is Carly. Equal protection,
Yeah.
We're allowed to treat people differently as long as we have a rational basis for doing so. So it's
Okay.
not, if we have a rational basis at the end of this needs assessment and engineering that we're going to be doing, and we're saying at the end of the day, we have X amount of water that's limited, but we as a community have a rational basis for prioritizing affordable housing or commercial, whatever the reason, the thing is that we value, then it's likely defensible that we could make that determination. We just need evidence
Okay.
to back it up. So right now we don't have that information. And that's where the needs assessment
Gotcha.
comes in. It can say like, this is why we're treating new development differently. This is why we're treating commercial development differently. Our standard goes up higher if we're discriminating based on, race or gender and all those kinds of things. But when it comes to these
Yeah,
sort of-
that's classically what I think of
Right,
when I
what you
of
think
equal
about.
protection, but I kind of got the impression that under Utah law, they are concerned with every property owner and every user. So I just wanted to see where the wiggle room was there, and I didn't know if it had been tested under the law, so blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah. Okay, thanks.
We can, there is a future where you as a council can make those kinds of decisions. We just need that rational basis established, and that's the work we're gonna do.
But there are two things though. There's like the water conservation that you don't need data.
No, because it's for everybody, right? So we're applying that to everyone.
But then there's
The
who
restriction.
gets the water with new construction.
Mm-hmm.
I should have been more clear. The action that I'm hoping for that's pretty immediate is the water conservation. I understand, and I think Mike and Ronnie understand that deeper, who gets a permit and who gets allocated water does take this deeper analysis. Okay,
We can do
right?
conservation now.
And Ronnie, did you hear that too? So it's kind of like two-part policy. The first part is the low-hanging fruit, that's the conservation methods. And then the second step, the bigger step, the one that is really going to set the carrying capacity, is the one we need.
Yeah, I understand we need more data for the latter, but yeah, I don't want to dilly-dally on the way to that, yeah.
No dilly-dallying.
So the needs assessment, though, is it at any point a controversial contention point with the state engineer?
No, because what we're talking about is not really safe yield in that case. We're talking about our own production capacity. So we're not like sort of saying, well, we can't do it because of the safe yield issue, which is something we can't determine. But what we can say is like, listen, we have this much bonding capacity. These are our water resources. We think there are problems with developing them, and so we're feeling limited, independent of any sort of state engineer determination. Does that make sense? Just because we have the water rights doesn't mean we're capable of developing them, or doesn't mean we can afford to develop it. So for that reason, we're able to establish that rational basis that's defensible. It's about us and not really the aquifer.
Gotcha. So there's not a large developer that could come in and be like, oh, I don't agree with
Unless
your
there's
assessment. Well, that's,
Unless there's
Yes, that's exactly what's going to happen. Yes, the developer is going to come in and say, Valleyfield isn't that hard to develop. I think your rational basis is crummy, and that would be something that we would maybe have to defend. So that's the work we want to do.
Or your analysis of who gets it and who
It
doesn't.
is unfair, or your application of it was discriminatory. You didn't follow your application correct. So yeah, any ordinance, like Mike said, he's completely right. Everything's complicated, and it's going to be expensive in one way or another. Our ordinances are cheap to develop, but expensive to defend. Water source development is expensive to develop, but non-controversial. So it's a lot to consider.
Okay, and thank you for the buffet of consideration. And 6